Well, that's some fascinating information coming out of Hong Kong. In fact, I would say it may be dangerous information. If the states actually followed your fiscal sustainability rules, I'd be out of a job. So I'm Jonathan Williams, Vice President of the Center for State Fiscal Reform at the American Legislative Exchange Council. I run all of our tax, budget, pension reform programs, and it's an honor to be with you today. Thank you to Dan, Cato Institute, for your leadership on tax and expenditure limitations across the world, also in Colorado specifically when we are fighting those battles with the Colorado Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which I'm going to talk about. How many here are familiar with TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in Colorado? So a good deal of you are, and that's good. We're going to talk about the story of TABOR going over the last 20 years or so. So from one of my favorite presidents here, the rationale why TABOR is necessary. Obviously, government doesn't reduce spending in itself. In fact, maybe my favorite living economist, outside of Dan Mitchell, of course, is Thomas Sowell out at the Hoover Institution. I think he probably said it more succinctly than President Reagan, and that is the first rule of economics is you have such a thing as a scarcity of resources, while the first rule of politics is to ignore the first rule of economics. And of course, that's how we get into the situation that we're in many times across the 50 states. And we study at ALEC, the 50, as we say, laboratories of democracy, what's going on across the 50 states. And we find that state fiscal rules are really all over the map as well. But I'm going to be talking about the gold standard, I think, of state fiscal restraint, which is Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Now, correctly noted by most is that 49 out of the 50 states have either a constitutional or a statutory balanced budget amendment. But as we know from the tales of Illinois and California, that doesn't do a lot to help in many cases. Many times those rules are routinely waived. And so when we talk about institutional spending control like we are today, and those familiar with the public choice theory of economics from George Mason, how many George Mason grads do we hear out of curiosity? We have a few. I know Dan is. And so we believe that there needs to be sustainable rules that will really go throughout the political cycles to protect taxpayers. And Colorado's is the gold standard when it comes to protecting taxpayers. I think a couple of the keys that come out of Colorado or to any good tax and expenditure limitation is, first of all, the rules need to be constitutional versus statutory. Time in and time out across the states, we've seen statutory spending rules and balanced budget rules routinely waived by the whims of the day for more spending or higher taxing authority. Secondly, when you create a metric by which to measure the growth of government, it needs to be something that's realistic that will protect taxpayers, such as population and inflation, which is what Colorado used with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Many states have tax and expenditure limitations that rely on things such as personal income growth, which personal income growth grows so quickly, especially during the economic expansionary periods, that we find it's virtually no limit whatsoever on the growth of government in those states. So, getting to Colorado, Taxpayer Bill of Rights was enacted as a constitutional initiative back in 1992. Since then, Colorado has been in effect, and there's been a few wrinkles to the story that we'll get to in a little while. However, it was voter approved by Colorado voters in 1992, and as you can see here, the formula for TABOR up on the screen, which was to basically take previous year's spending, add inflation and population growth, and then add any voter approved tax increases to that formula to get to your next limit of spending as their legislators are considering the next budget in Denver. And it's a constitutional limit, as I mentioned, on revenue collection, state spending, and legislative taxing authority. So not only controlled the growth of the budget and through revenue limits, but it also put a limit on the way that legislators can raise taxes in Colorado. And as we're going to talk about in a couple of slides, it's been one of the most effective ways at not just reducing the growth of government, but to stop tax increases in Colorado. And so what would happen is the legislature would have to pass the tax increase as a majority vote, as any state would, but then the tax increase would go to the voters for their approval. And as we'll say here in a second, Colorado voters have been pretty stingy in terms of the kind of taxes that they've approved since TABOR was enacted in 1992, because their view, as the view of the presenters before me, was that government ought to live within its means and not ask for more from taxpayers, especially during tough economic times. And TABOR applied to both state and local levels of government, and that's an important piece as well. Many times they wanted to, well, in the case of Colorado, they wanted to make sure that the state government did not put unfunded mandates on local levels of government. As, of course, states always are complaining that you all here in Washington are putting unfunded mandates on the states. Both that happens, of course, at the local level, and Colorado wanted to make sure that wasn't that cost shifting going from state to local levels of government. And then if the revenues came in above what we call the TABOR limit, which is what we just talked about with that formula, the excess revenue had to be refunded to taxpayers. And over the course of these 20-some years that TABOR's been in existence, there have been 21 different statutory mechanisms on how that refund would happen. Currently, it's a sales tax rebate, plus EITC expansion, plus personal income tax rate reductions. That's the current hierarchy of the rebate effect. But we've seen many others over the period of TABOR in Colorado. And then, as I mentioned, it required a vote of the people to raise taxes or to spend more than the TABOR limit. So people were, the citizens of Colorado were intimately involved in the budget decision-making in Colorado. There was we call it the TABOR Timeout, Referendum C, for those of you from Colorado familiar with that. Colorado had experienced a pretty difficult set of circumstances coming out of the 9/11 recession here. They also had extreme wildfires ravage the state at that period of time. Also, there was an education funding amendment put in, Amendment 23 back in 2000, that required K-12 education spending to grow regardless of what was happening to the overall size of the budget. So at that point, there was a referendum put on the ballot in 2005 to suspend TABOR for 5 years. That passed narrowly, but now TABOR is back into existence as of fiscal year 2010. Now, there have been many other efforts to weaken or dismantle the Taxpayer Bill of Rights since then, or I should say throughout the history of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Most of these efforts have gone down in flames, as you can see, the vote on all those statewide initiatives. Some were as little as to spend an additional $50 million on a project. Some were much larger than that, with $200 million requested. But the message of this is, time in and time out, those that believe in higher government spending and higher taxes have been rebuffed by Colorado taxpayers, with the sole exception of Referendum C that I just discussed. Here's the important thing. I think the lasting legacy of TABOR over these 20-some years is, in the 23 years that TABOR's been in existence, Colorado taxpayers have not seen one broad-based tax increase. Not one in the 23 years of TABOR. There was a narrow excise tax increase on cigarettes and alcohol back about a decade ago, but that was the only statewide approved tax increase that Colorado voters approved in the history of TABOR. So it's been an incredible protection of taxpayers. The most recent attempt to raise taxes and go up against the TABOR voter prohibition on tax increases was defeated 66 to 34%, despite the proponents of higher taxes spending more than $10.4 million. The opponents of the tax increase spent a grand total of $36,000. Something like the proponents of tax increases outspent the opponents by something like 289 times, yet it went down with 66% of the vote. Clearly, Colorado taxpayers did not want a tax increase. They wanted the TABOR limits to stay in place. Also, I mean, just generally, TABOR has kept Colorado's tax climate competitive. We saw that not only did Colorado not raise taxes, between 1997 and 2002, Colorado reduced taxes more than any other state in the nation. They also, as recently as just a month ago, the most recent estimates show that Colorado may see another TABOR refund for the first time in a decade because of partly legalized marijuana and the increased revenue coming in there, but generally economic growth has brought a new TABOR refund as of tax year 2015. And here's where Colorado stacks up personally in personal income tax, corporate income tax, both some of the lowest in the country. They're both flat rate taxes as well, which is obviously very important. Colorado's personal income tax was reduced to this level because of TABOR and the amount of budget restriction put in place and taxpayer savings allowed. You can see property tax and sales tax burdens are about average, so the government isn't making it up through those areas of taxes relative to the income tax. The remaining tax burden, that's all taxes outside the three big categories of income, property, and sales, one of the lowest in the country, and the state also avoids a death tax. And a couple of other benefits that we didn't cover there in terms of other than keeping taxes low and protecting spending growth was it certainly involves taxpayers in the budgeting process. So many times the average taxpayer feels removed from state budgeting processes. They see the argument over whether the conservative budget should be to grow government by 4% versus the 10% growth proposal. They don't know what's happening a lot of times in state government and state budgeting. This, through TABOR, allows taxpayers to be intimately involved in the process. But finally, I think it's awfully important to note that TABOR and effective tax and expenditure limitations like it help smooth out the boom and bust cycle that happens in state government. You know, we all have seen it in California. When times are good, their progressive income tax, capital gains tax, dividend taxes are booming, revenues are coming in, they're spending money like drunken sailors many times in California and many other states. When times are bad, if you remember after the 2008 downturn, California was issuing IOUs basically to state vendors because they didn't have a cash flow to pay them. If you were a California taxpayer and you were owed a refund in those tax years right after the 2008 recession, you had to wait maybe 6 months to get that refund from state government. That's the boom and bust cycle. If you don't have meaningful fiscal rules that limit the growth of government through constitutional measures, through things reasonable like population inflation growth, you're going to end up more like California. I think we can all agree states across the country want to avoid ending up more like California. So thank you very much for the time. It's been a pleasure.